Hey, can I extend a warm welcome to everybody to our series of webinars at Fawcett. Of course, in today's environment, particularly with the pandemic, our webinar series have become very popular, and we're delighted that we're able to offer this in partnership with our Fawcett affiliate partners. And more so today, a very strong partner of ours and a company that offers such needed services to our school, and that's GL Education. We have two colleagues from GL with us, namely Bernard and Crispin, who are joining us today as members of the team there at GL Education. And looking at your background here, I have to say, you're very well positioned in terms of the services you offer to our schools. They are joined by Michael and Trish, both of whom are teachers at GIS, Garden International School. And of course, they have a wealth of experience within our profession. And they will be presenting to everybody the experience they've had of using the GL educational tools in terms of assessment, school improvement, and today, more importantly, student well-being, and how we are able to assess that with the tools that GL Education offer. So I'm very grateful to GL Education for presenting this webinar. We have Bernard. I'll hand over to Bernard shortly, who will do the housekeeping with everybody. The only thing I would like to request is that Fawcett HQ and Lee May, who I'm always appreciative of her support with our webinars, will be circulating all the participants for your feedback. So please give us that, because that's quite important in terms of how you felt the webinar went today. So without further ado, and to give you more quality time on today's topic, I will hand over to Bernard to do the housekeeping, and away you go.
Thank you, John, and a very warm welcome to everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bernard Fawcett, one of the international consultants for GL Education. I'm a former secondary technology teacher. And for the last 4 years, I've been working with GL supporting schools across Asia. Before I introduce you to our panel, I would just like to point out that we will not be using the chat function during today's discussion. So if you do have questions, then please do submit them through the Q&A panel, which you'll see near the bottom of your screen. I will then relay your questions to the panel. If you can't see the Q&A option, you may need to just move your mouse around underneath the video to reveal it. I'm very excited to be able to introduce our panel to you today. I will come to each of them in turn and ask them just to give a brief introduction of themselves and a little bit of the context of where they're coming from today. So first of all, I'll come to you, Michael.
Okay, great. So as Bernard said, my name's Michael. I've been, this is my 9th year at Garden International School, so I've been in Malaysia for a fair while now. I came here as head of chemistry and have been doing the head of year role for a few years in each key stage, and then this year moved to the head of sixth form role and into SLT, and that's a very interesting year to move into SLT, as you can imagine. So for our school, all teachers have a real responsibility for academic care. But as a head of year previously, I was really interested to see how we could use the PAR survey to help identify students that would need maybe some extra support, and then work with those students to provide that support. So I was really intrigued when we first learned about PAR about 6 or 7 years ago now. I felt that we'd become a very kind of data-rich school, and I wanted to find ways to help staff members engage with the data that we had and to triangulate using data to support students. And so I spent some time over the last couple of years working closely with GL and putting in specific interventions to work with fragile learners, Did an MPQSL project last year where I really looked at those as a focus group, and then we published a case study on the GL website.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I'll come to you now, Trish. I think you're on mute, Trish.
Yeah. So I'm Trish, and I'm also working at Garden. I have been here for 4 years. I'm a learning support teacher, so I've been looking at PASS to look at our more challenged young people that and how they perceive themselves, because often how they look and how they come across and how they sound, if you then look at the PASS data, it looks entirely different when you actually get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and rather than them just saying what they think you want to hear, but being honest, you can then dig a little deeper and maybe go a little bit further. So I was actually at the Global Assessment Conference in November last year, and I had some data on a student I was working with that then went on to be part of that actual conference. And then it became a blog on the GL website of how I had actually used that data to support interventions and things for this particular student to help them go forward. This has opened my eyes and my faculty's eyes to how this can be done, like overall, and we can look at it to actually focus in on students, similar to what Michael's doing with fragile learners. What are our LS, what are our learning support students needing? What are they telling us? What can that? You might have a gut instinct, but it's really nice that the data supports you in that. You have a little look and you go, oh yeah, what I was feeling was right. I now have something else to move it forward. So that's why I'm here today.
Great, thank you, Trish. And Crispin.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Director of Education at GL. So my job really is to look after our assessments, make sure they're doing what they should be doing, and that we're supporting schools well in using those assessments. My background is as a teacher. So I had 14 years in the classroom in UK independent schools. I did a period of time overseas. And then a good chunk of time in UK state schools, latterly in a comprehensive in the north of England. I've run departments, but actually my last job was leading a pastoral function in that school. So I'm particularly passionate about PASS, as I can tell by the way Michael and Tricia are talking, they are too, and what that can do, always in the hands of educators, but to support learners and make sure that they're achieving the best they possibly can. So yeah, that's my background. Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you, Crispin. And now I'm going to kick things off with a first question, which I'll come to each of you with. So I'd just like you to sort of give us a little bit of an outline, really, about what were your concerns or your expectations, really, about student wellbeing at the start of the COVID crisis and as we move through that. So again, I'll come to you first, Michael.
Okay, so at the start of the crisis, I was the head of year in GIS, and I guess my priority at the time was to try and ensure safety and wellbeing of students in the year group, whilst at the same time thinking about their achievement and progress. And I guess my biggest concern was how do I go about monitoring that when the students are online and they're not in school, and I can't see them walking down the corridor at break time and lunchtime. So I guess it was about being able to do the job I'm employed to do effectively. And as you can imagine, as a head of year, you spend a lot of time working with the students who need more support. And if they weren't in school, so I could go in and see them when I needed to, I was worried that they would kind of go off the radar, so to speak, and my job would become incredibly difficult to just give the students the support they need. I think, of course, like all teachers, we were concerned about the move to online learning. I mean, it's new to almost all of us in education. And it became apparent very quickly that the demands on online learning for the students were quite different to being in the classroom. I would say there were massive additional organisational demands on the younger students. I was head of Year 7 last year when it first started, and also the level of independence required by the students is really high, and the students who needed more support with that just weren't in school. So I was really concerned about the achievement gap, and also students really just being impossible to reach. So that was definitely my first major concern. I think the social isolation nature of lockdown and learning from home was something that we're all concerned about as well. We know that learning and being in school, a lot of that is about socialization, and that's so important for our students. And when they are at home, their environments are very different, and we know that different families have responded to the crisis in completely different ways. Some students were at home and parents were sticking to the SOP really kind of rigidly, whereas others were actually taking a slightly more relaxed approach to things, and that would have impacted the students. We know that the parents themselves were coping with things in different ways and managing emotions more or less effectively, just depending on who they were. So there are just so many different factors that were outside of our control. And I think as a teacher, that puts us in a really uncomfortable position. And at the same time, we're just thinking, what's going on with our students? Are they okay? How's their well-being? I think I personally found it really hard to accept that there was less support that I could give the students when they were at home, but also equally thinking about my own well-being, and knowing that I'm not going to be much use for the students if I'm not also thinking about myself, and making sure that I'm doing everything I can to look after myself. So I think, to summarize, if you like, I was thinking about the isolation and the tolls that would have on the students, thinking about the demands of being online, the uncontrolled situations that students would find themselves in at home, and then, yes, another factor that would influence how they're feeling is, would their motivation for learning and for engaging with what we were doing online be able to be sustained over time? Because we had no idea how long this crisis was or is going to last for.
Thank you, Michael. And I'll come to Trish now with the same question, really, in terms of what were your concerns and expectations really at the start of all of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of them, obviously from an LS point of view, were very similar to Michael's, in that one of my big concerns was a lot of my job is that one-to-one interaction in a class. So if you've got, say, for example, an ADHD child, that you're constant. It's not that they're not paying attention or don't want to be paying attention, it's just that they're off. And you just have to wander by and kind of tap the desk and say, okay, what are we doing next? And they go, oh, okay. Well, how was I going to do that? How was I going to do that online? How could I tap the desk online? I didn't know. Also, once it kind of got off and started, it was, again, the isolation of which Michael talked about, of trying to get them to put cameras on. So again, the students, that it would have been a visual thing. I could have seen whether they were on task or not. If they were not putting their camera on, I could see nothing. I knew nothing. So I just had to assume that they were telling me how it was going. And often with the students that I deal with, they don't want to admit if they're struggling or it's difficult or whatever. So it's, how do I pull that out of them? Can I pull that out of them online? And as Michael was saying, it's that because there is a lot of one-to-one, or in a class, you wander around and you see the students that are struggling. It was that I want to help these students, but because it was a new thing to me too, it was, I'm not quite sure how to yet. So it's frustrating for me because I know these guys need help, but I don't know what help, and I don't know how, and I don't know what to do next. Add to that, as Michael was saying, it wasn't only an impact on the students, it was an impact on the teachers. So you have a relationship with a teacher, how they teach in class, how they teach in school, what they do. But obviously, how the online was going to affect them would depend on how tech savvy they were, or this or that. And there was a load of things going on with them. So you had to kind of be interacting with them and saying, how can I help? What can I do? Because we didn't know where we were going with this to start with. So that was a worry and a concern. It was like, what's it going to look like? How can we plan this out? How do we make it as manageable as possible and sort of help these students as much as possible? We know we can't do as much as we could if they were here, but we want to do as much as we can. And that frustration and that worry and concern of myself, as Michael was saying, I want to do what's best for these kids. I know these kids need this help, but how? So I guess kind of summary of that is how. I know what I want to do, but how's it going to look? How are we going to do it?
Thanks, Trish. And I'll come to you now, Crispin. And, you know, first of all, if you just sort of tell us a little bit, excuse me, tell us a little bit about your expectations really at the start of things. And then I know you're going to tell us a little bit more about what the data is telling us. So, but first of all, if you just tell us about your expectations and then perhaps go on to tell us about what the data, excuse me, is actually showing us.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I think it's really interesting to hear Michael and Tricia's insights there. I think in terms of expectations going into the pandemic, mine were very open. I was almost trying not to have any because it was clearly going. We've never been here before. This is new to all of us, and there were clearly going to be very different scenarios and reactions, right from kind of sectors of the education system right down to individual students in schools. I have to say, my overriding emotion at the start of this was I was feeling for the teachers and feeling for people who are in Michael and Tricia's position, having been a pastoral lead and knowing that in normal times, you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning worrying about the sort of, 3 or 4 kids who are the real focus at that particular time. So the thought of worrying about those students and not looking into their eyes every day at the start of the day, gauging what they're, how they're feeling as they come into school, figuring out whether you need to pick up the phone home to find out if everything's okay. Not having that day-to-day feedback must have been, really, really concerning. So so I really feel for Tricia and Michael, I think, on that front. But yeah, other than that, I think sort of expectations a little bit suspended. And I think snippets that I was getting that were kind of keeping my mind open were things like, it's easy to make the assumption, well, your underprivileged kids are going to struggle because they haven't got the support at home, and your more privileged kids will have professional parents at home who know how to support them. And actually, I'm the governor or a governor at our local primary school. And as we were talking to the head teacher and talking to people in the community, actually that wasn't necessarily the case. We had children from very well-off and privileged backgrounds, but where both parents have very high pressure jobs. There's no flexibility from employers in terms of allowing them to cope with homeschooling because they're both working all hours from dawn till dusk. And that child is potentially doesn't, having difficulty getting bandwidth to do any homework or schoolwork. And certainly nobody's got the time to sit down with them for a couple of hours and help them work through what they may be struggling with. So that child from that sort of more privileged background is going to struggle as much as one who's maybe had a bit more support from a less privileged background. So all those assumptions, I think, were a bit up in the air, and I was very open-minded in terms of expectations. If I come on to what we found in the data, this is going to sound a strange thing to say, but I'm delighted to say that there isn't an enormous amount to say. And I'm not being flippant there. I think this really could have gone either way. We could have looked into this data and found that children were desperately worried about being about school, feeling they'd lost loads of learning, anxious about reintegrating. And I think it's testament to what schools have done across the world and the work of people like Michael and Trish in all of those schools, that actually the data has remained pretty consistent. We haven't seen any huge shifts either up or down across the 9 factors in PASS. And that's very reassuring, I think. So we've looked at data from September to November 2018, and matched those schools to data from the same period in 2020. So we've looked at about 160,000 students across the world. The picture is slightly different in international and UK schools. I think overall, it's fair to say that the picture has been particularly positive in international schools compared to other schools. Again, these are small effects, but they're certainly there and they're certainly noticeable. So digging into the data a little, I think I'll just pull out sort of three main themes that we're finding, or three main areas where we've seen effects. The first one is in the feelings about school factor. So this is just about, you know, how happy are children to be in school. And there we've seen an improvement. We've seen that improvement across the board, actually, but a noticeable increase in students' happiness to be in school. Now, Michael and Trish will be able to talk about how that's played out in their schools and whether they've seen that and what they think explains that. Certainly in my local primary school, we were talking about this yesterday as a governor's team. And there was a sense that, first of all, for the children, this is a sense of a return to normality. It's back into some structure and some routine that has been missing from their lives and that they've wanted. The other one, which I think is interesting, which actually came from a couple of the teachers on the governing board, was that actually the return to school has been into a very controlled environment. So certainly in our school, children are in bubbles, children are sitting in seats all facing the same way, they're with their teachers all day, there's not much interaction with people outside their bubbles. So what can be the sort of creative chaos of a school, if you want to look at it that way, isn't actually there currently. And there was a sense that actually that sense of order means that perhaps some of those relationship difficulties that can affect that factor around feelings about school aren't there right now, because A, they're just back in school, and B, they're in a very structured and controlled environment. So I thought that was an interesting one to pull out, but we've seen that consistently across the world, that feelings about school has gone up. And that's great news. And I guess it validates the fact that, you know, we all as educators are passionate about the fact that we want kids to be happy in schools, and we think they're good places for them to be. The second one, which I was less expecting, is that preparedness for learning. So that sort of knowing how to be a good learner has also seen a significant increase in the data. Now, again, that's an interesting one, and I wonder whether that might be to do with the fact that actually they've had to learn to be good learners, because exactly as Trish was just saying, they don't have Trish sitting next to them saying, you know, focus and get your head down and get on with it. They've had to be self-managed learners to an extent through all of this. So it'd be interesting to see if that carries through, if that's maybe one of the positive impacts of this period, that we actually have some more independent learners on our hands. It'd be interesting to see, and I'll be interested to hear what Michael and Trish have to say about that. Where we have seen dips are in the confidence in learning and in their self-efficacy or self-regard as a learner. So those two areas we've seen a dip. They tend to be linked. If you see an effect in one, you tend to see an effect in the other. Now, I think probably a bit less surprised by that. Confidence in learning in particular is linked to that sense of, when they're faced with a challenge, do they have the resilience and the grit to persevere through that challenge in their learning? Now, we know that resilience can often be affected by the support that students have outside their family. So obviously school is really the next step of that, and that's obviously been absent. It's also correlated to a general feeling of optimism about life. Now, I know, you know, all of us who are parents will have done everything that we can to try and shield our children from the anxiety that we've all felt with what's going on in the world. But again, as you all know, as educators, children are sensitive beasts and they will pick up on things. So I wonder whether that sort of sense of not having that wider support network, and maybe a sense of there's something going on in the world that is denting their optimism, might have had an impact there on their confidence in learning. So those two areas we've seen dips. Again, slight dips. These are not big effects. They're small effects, but significant nonetheless. So I think overall, a positive picture so far. I think there were 2 notes of caution that I would sound at this point. One is I was reading yesterday about some recent assessment data in the US that has shown that following an initial impact on learning, that children have actually made progress during lockdown and from remote learning. So a sort of positive picture from there. But Scott Marion, who's the executive director of the Centre for Assessment in the US, used a lovely phrase. He said that they have a saying apparently in New England, which is, you can have 1 foot on a wood stove and another on a block of ice, and on average, you're pretty comfortable. And so the point he was making was that the overall picture may be that learning has progressed over that period of time. But when you get underneath that into the detail, there will be students who have excelled and really benefited, and there will be students who have really struggled and who we need to dive into. And I would say the same thing about this past data. Overall, it's a positive picture, and we've done a fantastic job of supporting young people, but it's absolutely critical that we dive underneath that and find, you know, where are our stoves who've really benefited from this, but where are our blocks of ice? Where are those students who actually are really struggling? And we need to make sure that we need to get closer. And I know that will be Michael and Trish's focus, and clearly is from everything that they've said so far. I think that the last note of caution is, this is early snapshot data. We need to, you know, this is kids just back in school. My question is there a honeymoon effect here? So we want to look carefully at the data over the next 6 to 12 months to see whether this carries on or whether actually we see a dip.
Thank you, Crispin. And I'm going to come to Michael and Trish now. I'm not sure which way round you want to answer this really, so I'll leave it to Trish and Michael to decide. But you know, how does what Crispin's been telling us about the global picture, how does that compare to what you've been seeing in school? And I'll add to that as well. You know, have you been able to re-survey students more recently to see whether the picture's changed? So I know there's a lot to answer there in terms of how that compares and, you know, where you are with things at the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting to listen to Crispin's kind of overview there. So we do the PASS survey each year in November, and one of the first things that I wanted to do was to compare the data like pre-crisis in 2019 November with what we got last November in 2020, and it's amazing what you said exactly is what we found, that in 7 out of 9 of the PASS factors the scores were identical. There was no change at all. What you said is also absolutely right. Probably there was no change because of that, the extremities kind of cancel each other out to some point. And so it is really important with the PASS data not to just look at those headline figures, because really we want to, as educators, we want to support the students that need the support. So we've got to go deeper. But the 2 factors that did change at a whole school level, you mentioned one, feelings about school. Yeah, I've got my own thoughts about why that's gone up. I think you're right. I think a lot of it is what you were saying. I think that a lot of our students realised that although what we were doing and delivering online was very good, I think they just appreciated that learning in school is different, and they kind of missed being in school. And so I think that kind of feelings for school did go up, and I think that's kind of reflected by what I've heard from students as well since they've been back. I think as a school, like we put a lot of value in student voice, and I think students know that we ask them continuously how things are going, and I think we did that even more so when they were at home. We wanted to try and get regular lay of the land and tap into students' well-being, and I think students realised that we were doing that because we care, and I think then they kind of really valued I guess what we were trying to do for them as a school. So I wasn't surprised to see the feelings about school going up. we did quite a few other things as well. So we had regular communications that went out to the community, and our school leaders were making video updates on a regular basis, just trying to be as transparent as we could about the situation. We were reaching out to exam boards to find out what was the state of play with exams, and we were all the time communicating what we knew back to the students. And I think they really appreciated that. And I think the students knew that we had their backs. We were doing what we could. We didn't want them to get behind with their learning. And our teachers in GIS, absolutely fantastic, were just, they were professionally developing like never before, trying to find new, better ways to reach out to the students. And it was, it was great to be part of the senior leadership team at that time to really kind of witness it. The other factor that increased at whole school level was related. Attitudes to attendance went up. It's high anyway, but it jumped up, and I felt, possibly for similar reasons, that students just realised that it's important for them to be back in school. So I wasn't surprised to see that one go up. I know also that we put some extra emphasis on celebrating attendance, online attendance to lessons when students were at home, and we were sending emails home every week for those 100% attenders. And so perhaps that extra recognition that we were putting on attendance helped students to kind of see more value in it as well. And maybe that's what also led to that increase. Now, as I said, as a whole school level, it doesn't always tell the full story. So as head of sixth form, I was very keen to look at that cohort in year 12 and 13. And they obviously went through a really challenging year, with exams being cancelled last year in Malaysia. And this year for Cambridge, they're not cancelled. So a lot of our students are still in a very kind of precarious and anxious state because of that. But what I found looking at the past data, there was a huge increase in the attitudes to teachers factor. And this particularly for year 12 into year 13. And I thought that was really interesting. And again, there's lots of reasons why we might have seen that, but I do really feel that the students recognised that the teachers were going above and beyond. And even though they knew that their exams had been cancelled, the teachers were really still trying to make sure that we were covering all the content and giving them access to get started into year 13 material when they were in year 12. And so we were doing everything we could to keep the students motivated, putting on extra enrichment sessions for our students. And I think also, and I'm a sixth form chemistry teacher myself as well, I know that the teachers were spending more time in their lessons online, checking in with the students on a personal level. So I wasn't just talking about chemistry to the students, but I was actually taking 5 minutes at the start of every lesson to ask the students what they had done in the last 24 hours that had kind of been really enjoyable, or what did they have in the last couple of days that they really enjoyed, even if it was just something about what they'd eaten, just showing them that there was more to my interest in them than their ability to solve a chemical equation. And I think we were all doing that. And I think that was really kind of, that's where we see the students' recognition of their relationships with their teachers has evolved and improved. And if I can, just to talk a bit about the fragile learners. So I spent some time last year in the MPQSL looking at the fragile learners in school. One of the first things I wanted to do was compare how they were getting on after a year of pandemic crisis around the world. And so I was looking to see whether our lists of fragile learners had changed over the course of the year. And that was quite interesting. I found that there were a lot of students in the younger year groups that actually had higher perceived learning capabilities and moved out of what I was classifying as a fragile learner group or category. And quite a lot of other students had moved in and taken their place. So it was really quite fluid, a lot of movement. in Key Stage 3. And when we looked at the older students, there was hardly any movement at all. It was exactly the same 2 or 3 students. Sorry, it was probably only 2 or 3 students that moved within and out of those categories. Now, again, lots of different factors at work here, I'm sure, but I did read quite a lot before about how attitudes become more, I think, ingrained and robust, more difficult to change with older students. And I think that's probably what's reflected there in those numbers to some extent. And I don't know whether anyone else has any kind of thoughts on that, but it was interesting to see. It was great to see students who we'd worked with before and put interventions in place now no longer being fragile learners, but also new students that have come onto the radar that we have to work closely with now, and to make sure that we give them the support and intervention they need, so that we can try and increase their confidence in their ability to do well in school. I don't know if I want to. I could keep talking about my own feelings, but I'll give Trish a chance maybe to have a.
Okay, thanks. Well, a lot of what we saw in LS very much mirrors what Michael saw overall. So, for example, if we had kids that had anxiety issues, they thrived. They did really well during online learning, because all of the things that would have caused them the anxiety before they'd ever sat down in a classroom were taken out. They were at home with their mom or their dad or their cat or whatever, and they could, all the rest of the stuff could kind of get put aside, and they could focus on what they were learning. So they were probably, so when you kind of talk about the balance, they probably increased. But then our kids with the organisational issues that needed that one-to-one in class, what we're doing, what we're getting out of our bag, what we're doing next, they found that very difficult, because there was so many other things that they could be doing. And if they had the camera off, there was so many other things that they could be focusing on. So that's probably how they kind of balanced themselves out within the past data. But with that then gave us a challenge as an LS department and a school. And I have to say exactly the same as Michael said, because I'm in different classes with different teachers supporting. So I might go for the student through science, English and maths possibly, or whatever else. The teachers very much were aware of the fact that it wasn't all about the subject. It was about 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of the lesson. Hi guys, how are we all today? Blah, blah, and have we had a good weekend if it was a Monday morning or whatever, and letting people know that they kind of weren't on their own, so that trying to kind of address that isolation. And as Michael said, the teachers at GIS were just really amazing on that and worked hard at that without a doubt. We as a faculty did a student voice when we came back about how things went, and I will take no credit for that. That was a colleague of mine, Manjot, that did that and organised that. But some of the data back from that was very interesting, because even the ones that had said, oh, online was okay, but I'm much happier being back at school. I'm much happier being back. So even the ones that didn't hate online and weren't saying it was a disaster and oh my God, they were even going, but I definitely see the positives of being back in school. So that is probably why the being back in school, past data rose, because even the ones that may have not, school might not have been their favourite place in the first place. But I think even the kids, like the organisational kids or the kids that find school difficult, so have issues with coming to school, realise how much more support they get and how much easier it is if you're in school and there's people there to support and there's people there to help. So they actually went, oh, do you know what? It's tough, but it's tougher on my own. And they kind of bought into that. So I think there was a definite feeling of that for sure. So that's probably where some of that balance came from, I think.
That's great. Thank you both. I'm conscious that the time is passing quite quickly. So I'm going to come back to Michael and Trish, just to ask you really in terms of what's worked best, and given your experience, what would you do differently next time?
I think for what went best, I guess it was a real big learning curve for us all. And I think it was, we all learned as we were kind of going along. But I think things like Pear Deck and things like that students could actually upload their thing, their answers then and there, and the teacher could see them then and there, and they could, if I was there, I could ask to maybe be put in a breakout room to go and speak one-to-one to maybe one of my LS students because they just hadn't seemed to grasp it at all, and things like that. I think, so the breakout rooms on a Zoom were fantastic. Having 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning, so our school were very good at giving us a very nice break between lessons. They were really thoughtful about timetabling and having that computer free time or that screen down time, or just that bit of time where you weren't constantly staring at a screen. But that also gave you a nice opening to have 5 or 10 minutes with the teacher in the class before you started, so that you could have a chat about who you thought might struggle, or who you thought I might need to help, or who you might want to put in different breakout rooms. Make your other teacher a co-host so that you had time to do things, that you could separate jobs or things like that, So things like that worked as well. But I think the one-to-one intervention was difficult because of child protection and various other things. There was a lot of what do we do with that? So that obviously was something that we wanted to look at maybe going forward. How do we do that differently maybe the next time? But overall, like I said, the just actually working with colleagues and we as a department would try and catch up once a week just to go, what have you done in your class? I did this and it didn't work so well. Has anybody got any ideas? And again, GIS are a great school for that. Everybody kind of saying, I've tried this and it worked, I tried this and it didn't, or if you've tried this and it did it a bit strange, or it was probably because of this. And we kind of came together as a team, and I think that's key. I think it's just, and also being vulnerable a little, just being able to say, I don't know, anybody out there can give me a hand, I will accept it, thank you. And I think again, as a school and as a team, we do that very well. We are very open to, hi, can you give me a hand please, because I'm not quite sure. And there's inevitably somebody out there that does and will pitch in and help. So I think that's a big thing.
Thanks, Trish. Sorry, Michael. I was just going to ask, because we've had a question come in through the Q&A about the timeline, and I just wondered, before you give your view on what worked best, Michael, very, very quickly, would you just explain the timeline for when you were in school, when you were remote learning, when you were blended?
Yeah, so it's quite complicated because we've gone through phases of from kind of last March closing in the first instance, and then being off for the rest of that academic year, and then starting with face-to-face at the start of this academic year, and then going to online learning for short stints, and then kind of coming back. So it has been on and off quite often. So yeah, it's been quite bitty. We have been in school now for a while, but even so, in Malaysia, we've had some. It's not always just been go back to normal full school. We had a situation where we started bringing in exam groups first. We were allowed to, and then we were able to phase in other year groups. So yeah, it's difficult to say there was a set day or set amount of time that we've been in or out. At the moment, we're in a position where we can all be in school face to face for our learning, but we've got to that point in the year that our exam groups are now off timetable. So yeah, it's been really muddled, and that's not without its challenges for the students, but the staff as well. The kind of continual changing of timetables and the situation really has a huge impact on staff well-being, and also for the parents at home who are perhaps working with their children. If we're changing timetables and having to close, and they've got to get arrangements for childcare, it's the whole community that are kind of being impacted by this crisis, as we know. If I could just go back to add on to what Trish was saying about what I feel has worked well and what we might do moving forward. So I know we're short on time. She's absolutely right with what she was saying. I think for me, one of the strengths, I would say, in our school over the last few years is we've tried to talk more to the students about their well-being. It's become a more normal conversation, and I think normalizing that question, like how are you doing, is really important. And I'm not sure that, well, I can say for sure that we're not all there yet in terms of not all of our students can talk freely about how they're feeling, but I do think that's something that we need to keep working on. And we're lucky in the respect that our students are very used to getting surveys where we ask that question. And so when we move to online learning, it's easy for us to implement regular checking surveys to get like a temperature test of well-being with the students. So I think that's what we would continue to do, and we will continue to work with our students to realize, or help them recognize and realize that we take their well-being seriously, and we're investing heavily in that. And just one thing I wanted to kind of touch on. So for next year, we're implementing a new social and emotional learning program at GIS, which is, I guess, an avenue for us to explicitly teach students and help them develop the competencies of managing their emotions more effectively. So once we put that in place, it's just another way that we're trying to equip our students with the tools to be able to deal with these kind of challenges and adversity that they're going to get in the future.
I think Michael was frozen, so I don't think we quite heard the end of that, Michael. I'm conscious of time, so we've gone over a little bit on time, but I'm just going to come to you, Crispin, for the last word, really, in terms of what about the long term, and are we going to be revisiting the PASS analysis again this year? Would you just very, very quickly give us an overview of the longer term view of things, Crispin?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bernie. So I'll be very brief. The answer is yes. We are going to be revisiting the PASS data, just as we'll be revisiting the attainment data. So we've been really clear. You know, we've done an initial snapshot. What's important in all of this, though, is what does this look like in 1, 2, 3 years' time? You know, are we getting back to some sort of normality, or is there a lasting impact from this? And so we'll be working really closely with schools to explore that. I think my final comment would be, you know, on that basis, though, just hearing what Michael and Trish have been saying about what they've been doing in those schools, in their schools. I mean, their schools, sorry. You know, how inspiring to hear that amazing work that's going on. And I know that with the quality of school that makes up the Fawcett family, this will be replicated in schools across Fawcett. And as a parent myself, you know, I would be absolutely thrilled to know that the school that my children were at, that they were being looked after in the way that Michael and Trish are doing so. So just, you know, congratulations on managing to achieve all of that through such a tough period. It's yeah, really inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd just like to mention one last thing that John in his introduction mentioned about a survey which will go out to everyone in the next 48 hours. We would ask for people to complete that and give us your feedback on the session today. and that will also have a link to the recording for the session as well. So do look out for that email. I think that's all we've got time for today. I hope you've all enjoyed the session as much as I have. I apologise that we've overrun a little bit on the time, but I think it was worth listening to all of the things that our panelists had to say today. The case study blogs that Michael and Trish mentioned in their introduction as well are on our website. If you've got any questions, please do get in touch with us. And really all that's left for me to do today is to thank FOBISIA for allowing us to be involved in this webinar and for John's introduction today, and to finally thank our panelists, Trish, Michael and Crispin, for your contributions today. So thank you all for joining us, and all that's left for us now to say is goodbye.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed that webinar, and particularly the case studies and the feedback. Fantastic, really. And I was especially interested in to see that students are recognizing the efforts teachers are making in supporting them during this pandemic. And so it's good to see. And as Crispin mentioned, you know, we see every day the efforts our teachers, our school leaders are putting in during these challenging circumstances. And, you know, it gives us such credibility as a profession, and great models are going on, you know, so well done, everybody. And thanks for a great webinar, GL Education, and thanks for being a greater partner to FOBISIA. Well done.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.